Hello, and welcome back for another of George MacDonald's Unspoken Sermons. I figured that we might as well end Series 1, where it all began, here in the Darkling Woods. So today's sermon is kind of an odd one to end the series with, because it's a little goofy, in my opinion. It has some odd arguments, but it also has a number of great quotes, which we'll get to in a second. It's called The God of the Living. And MacDonald begins it with a quote from Luke 20:38, saying, "He is not a God of the dead, but of the living, for all live unto him." So MacDonald begins with a rather confusing paragraph, kind of exploring what that means. So if it says God is a God of the living, what does that mean for previous generations who have passed away? Does that mean that they are still alive in some way? Or does that just mean that God is still the same for those who are living today as he was for those who lived in the past? A little confusing, but MacDonald is going to make the argument that those past generations are still alive in God. And he gives an image about what it would look like if that were not the case. If we were only able to count on God for being our God while we happened to be alive. And what kind of God would that look like? He says, "Shall God call himself the God of the dead, of those who were alive once, but whom he either could not or would not keep alive? Is that the Godhead and its relation to those who worship it? The changeless God of an ever-born and ever-perishing torrent of life, of which each atom cries with burning heart, 'My God,' and straightway passes into the godless cold." And then he imagines God saying, "Trust in me, for I took care of your fathers once upon a time, though they are gone now. Worship and obey me, for I will be good to you for 80 and 10, or thereabouts. And after that, when you are not, and the world goes on all the same without you, I will call myself your God still." MacDonald says that God changes not. Once God, he is always God. If he has once said to a man, "I am thy God," and that man has died, then we have the right to say that God is the God of the dead. But he's going to say that's not the case. He says that to let them die would be undoing what he had already done in making them. To let his creatures die would be to change, to abjure his godhood, to cease to be that which he had made himself. If they are not worth keeping alive, then his creating is a poor thing, and he is not so great nor so divine as even the poor thoughts of those dying creatures have been able to imagine him. So he's saying that if God's poor dying creatures imagine God to be able to keep them alive and think that he will, but he doesn't, then they are imagining a God greater than he actually is. And that's absurd, is what he's saying. And it's kind of like Anselm's argument for the existence of God as a being greater than which no other being can be conceived. But he continues on saying that just because somebody dies and passes from our sight doesn't mean that he's passing from God's sight as well, and it's not still in God's vision and mind. "But if God could see us before we were, and make us after his ideal, that we shall have passed from the eyes of our friends can be no argument that he beholds us no longer. The living one cannot name himself after the dead, when the very Godhead lies in the giving of life. Therefore they must be alive. If he speaks of them, remembers his own loving thoughts of them, would he not have kept them alive if he could? And if he could not, how could he create them? Can it be an easier thing to call into life than to keep alive?" Which is exactly what Pascal says regarding resurrection. But now MacDonald imagines an objector, and that objector is going to make a really interesting point. He says, well, okay, if they live to God, they are aware of God then. And if they are aware of God, they are conscious of their own being, because it's hard to be aware of something without knowing that you can be aware of things. And then they say, "Whence then the necessity of the resurrection?" So he's gone from saying that these past generations are still alive in God's mind, essentially. And then the objector is like, well, then why do they need to be resurrected ever? And MacDonald says it is for relationship with others and for the continued revelation of God to them. He says, "For their relation to others of God's children in mutual revelation, and for the fresh revelation of God to all. But let us inquire what is meant by the resurrection of the body. With what body do they come? Surely we are not required to believe that the same body is raised again. That is against science, common sense, Scripture. St. Paul represents the matter quite otherwise. One feels ashamed of arguing such a puerile point. Who could wish his material body, which has indeed died over and over again since he was born, never remaining for 1 hour composed of the same matter, its endless activity depending upon its endless change, to be fixed as his changeless possession, such as it may then be, at the moment of death, and secured to him in worthless identity for the ages to come? A man's material body will be to his consciousness at death no more than the old garment he throws aside at night, intending to put on a new and a better in the morning. To desire to keep the old body seems to me to argue a degree of sensual materialism. So MacDonald here pulls out a little bit of science, because it turns out he was really interested in it and even wanted to go into it as a career path for a while. He says that our bodies are always changing. They're not made out of the same matter or the same cells from day to day, let alone in the afterlife. He goes on to say that, as well might a Christian desire that the hair which has been shorn from him through all his past life should be restored to the risen and glorified head. I think he's just being goofy now. But with regards to resurrection and looking at what that could look like, he says, let us first ask, what is the use of this body of ours? It is by the body that we come into contact with nature, with our fellow men, with all their revelations of God to us. It is through the body that we receive all the lessons of passion, of suffering, of love, of beauty, of science. It is through the body that we are both trained outwards from ourselves and driven inwards into our deepest selves to find God. There is a glory and might in this vital evanescence, this slow glacier-like flow of clothing and revealing matter that is this ever-uptossed rainbow of tangible humanity. It is no less of God's making than the spirit that is clothed therein. And he says that this physical world is of such importance to us because God made it, and he intended to make it. It wasn't an accident or a bad thing like in Gnosticism. And he says that if people in heaven were not allowed to have the physical world around them and see a sunset or see a snowdrop, they would actually kind of miss it, which is an interesting thing to imagine. So he says that he thinks we will have physical bodies in the future. But he continues saying, all this revelation, however, would render only a body necessary, not this body. The fullness of the word resurrection would be ill met if this were all. We need not only a body to convey revelation to us, but a body to reveal us to others. The thoughts, feelings, imaginations which arise in us must have their garments of revelation, whereby shall be manifest the unseen world within us to our brothers and sisters around us. Else each is left in human loneliness. He says, now, if this be one of the uses my body served on earth before, the new body must be like the old. Nay, it must be the same body, glorified as we are glorified. The accidental, the non-essential, the unrevealing, the incomplete will have vanished. That which made the body what it was in the eyes of those who loved us will be tenfold there. So MacDonald is saying that our bodies will come back. They will be purified of their badness and have all the good things that our loved ones appreciated kind of amplified. And he says, will not this be the resurrection of the body? Of the same body, though not of the same dead matter? But of the importance of being himself again, of having the same body that his friends would recognize. He says, ah, my friends, what will resurrection or life be to me? How shall I continue to love God as I have learned to love him through you, if I find that he cares so little for this human heart of mine, as to take from me the gracious visitings of your faces and forms? I shall not care that the matter of the forms I loved 1,000 years ago has returned to mingle with the sacred goings-on of God's science, upon that far-off world, wheeling its nursery of growing loves and wisdoms through space. What an interesting way of seeing decomposition, to call it the sacred goings-on of God's science. Upon that far-off world, wheeling its nursery of growing loves and wisdom through space. That's what we're doing. And that just smacks of MacDonald's idea of spiritual evolution through time, saying that Earth is a nursery of growing loves and wisdoms flying through space. But I'll stop there, and I'm not going to read his actual conclusion because it doesn't tie to the next sermon like his other ones do. And that's because we're at the end of the series, as I mentioned, and there are 2 more series yet to come. I can't wait to start series 2 because he says in the dedication of it, he says, "These also after 18 years to my wife." So he waited 18 years from doing that first series to go to this second series. But I might take a bit of a hiatus from doing these because I don't feel like I have enough time to do them justice right now. I'm trying to finish my PhD, as you know, so I don't have a lot of free time to dig into the nitty-gritty of his sermons. But as I'm reading through them and getting more out of them than I ever got before, I'm still thinking, I wish I had more time. So what I think I'm going to do is actually turn my attention towards the Pulling Threads playlist on my channel, because those are kind of more fun, off-the-cuff things that I'll be better able to do with the time allotted to me. But I definitely want to come back to Series 2 of George MacDonald's thing, but that might be in like 6 months when I'm actually finished with my PhD. Can't wait. Anyway, thanks for stopping by for George MacDonald's Unspoken Sermons, Series 1. So I don't know if you can hear all the birds. I've tried to scare them off, but I think I just made them angry. They're cute, though. Plus are the perils of the darkling wood, I suppose.